Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Love That Loves You Back, a podcast between myself, Valerie Kabov, and my dear friend Jonathan Fremantle. I'm an artistic miscreant, otherwise known as a self-described third-generation art professional who's currently raising a fourth-generation art professional, born in the depths of the Pale of Settlement in the former Soviet Union, partly raised in Australia, by a quirk of fate relocated to Zimbabwe, where I'm the co-founder of First Floor Gallery Harare, trying to figure out life, education, art, predominantly love of art.
Jonathan Fremantle. I grew up in Cape Town, studied in London. I did a long apprenticeship in fine art in the old sense and have been making art in one way or another ever since then. I live in Edinburgh now, but I also lived for a while in Johannesburg where I had Hazard Gallery. And that was the context that I met Valerie. Just loved the conversation we had immediately about painting and how painting is everything. That conversation's been a constant source of joy and sustenance over the years. So it does make sense that we share the conversation and look forward to where this goes.
We always come back to art because it is the love that loves us back. Hi, everybody. This conversation is with a very special, in a manner of speaking, a spontaneous guest, Abdollah Nafisi. Abdollah, I met by following him on Instagram. And this happened, what is it, like a couple of months ago, because I spotted an installation or like a sculpture installation you were doing for Freeze, right? And you thanked me for following you. And that started a conversation. And this is how spontaneous we are in this podcast. We go with the flow on so many levels. And then I just said to Jonathan, let's do this. Let's
Yeah.
interview Abdullah. Abdullah is a sculptor slash furniture maker, which is also an interesting kind of coexistence and co-practice. Tell us a little bit about who you are.
First of all, Valerie, Jonathan, thanks so much for having me. We met on Instagram, we got to know each other there, and the spontaneity reminded me of what I'm reading on Immanuel Kant, and it says, we are all reception and spontaneity. So that was a perfect intro. So I'm a guy that my friends know if you ask me, I don't have plan B. So I'm more about plan A. I stopped my furniture making business really before I decided to make sculptures. However, I'm going to take you back in time a little bit. I was born in Tehran, in Iran. It was a strange time when I was born because it was at the time that there was a huge war. Iraq had attacked Iran, and I was in the middle of that war. And it was a big realization for me as a child that it was, in a way, fun because I thought that's what the world is. There was no internet. So when you're born into something like this, you think, well, okay, people are born this way, and then there is bomb, there is fun, there is family, there is
Mm.
cartoon, then there's cuts. So there I really realized how to be able to maneuver myself in the middle of all of that and be spontaneous and have fun. So I really saw the life. I'm ridiculously optimistic. As you can tell, if there was an aeroplane coming to the city to attack, I would just go upstairs and try to draw it, and all I could see was a line, you know. And my mother was an architect. At the same time, all of this was going on, and she was grabbing me in the back of her Renault 5, and we would just go to the architect school in the Tehran University. And my height wasn't high enough to see what they were doing on the tables.
Mm.
Because they were making these maquettes and models of buildings. So I found my way to sculpture studios.
Mm.
And Tehran University was a really good university. It was, I think, one of the top 10 universities in the world for the arts because Shah at the time, he had really invested so much from all around the world, bringing some of the best, which some of them were still going to university there after the revolution. It was just after the revolution at the time. And I was very lucky as a child to be grown up around these architects and sculptors and looking at what they were doing in their practice. And I absolutely loved there was this sense of understanding about what these sculptors were doing. I didn't know what it means, why they're doing it,
Mm.
but it just made sense to me so much that I was having dreams as a child that I was digging something, it was making sense to me, and this feeling that I knew what I was doing. And it was such a good feeling. That suddenly I'm gonna take you forward in
Mm.
time. I want to tell you a little bit about how I learned the concept and made my decisions of how I become a sculptor, how I learned about material and my skill and craft. At the same time, my dad is an inventor. My mother was an architect. So now imagine that I am flipping the pages of these books about Le Corbusier, and then that was my fascination with these boxes and cubes and a tree growing in the middle of a house and how you would just cut out the ceiling for a tree to grow. As a child, I was thinking like, oh yeah, this is fascinating. This is the future I want. And to me, it was future because I hadn't seen anything like it. I thought that this is a book about future. And my father had a dream, and his dream was to produce paper pulp out of agricultural waste. So he was building these like small, and his idea was that he wanted to build small factories next to any farm around the world so that all farmers will become paper makers. And so we will stop cutting trees. So this idea of using agricultural waste instead of cutting trees, and the trees thought became something important to me. But I was also my dad's little engineer. So I was going to this workshop. I learned welding, how to use an angle grinder, and that was so much fun. I could just weld things to one another. And my brother also, he was so into making forms and shapes. I remember he made a little turtle and later a crocodile. I was like, wow, I can use waste into making forms. And I kept on doing that. But in my 20s, I decided to go and travel with nomadic tribes in Iran
Wow.
because there was this sensation that I had, still do. I think it was a gift that I could say in the time and space that I was in, what a gift it is. What are the gifts that are around me that are not going to be there in the next few years, or maybe I am not going to be here, that I should pay attention to? And my way of looking at it, if there was a German or Swiss tourist was here, what would be most interesting in the area that I'm in? Because what is it that I'm not seeing that is so local to me that I've become blind to? And that was nomadic tribe.
Mm.
I thought that I'm going to go and learn of how do their crafts and understanding of nature become something that is so global? How come they are not trained in the best universities in the world and they're born in nature, but their product ends up in museums? How is that? So I really wanted to decode it, and then I started entering in the world of music and how they were connecting. And it's a constant state of high, I think, constant state of walking in nature, smelling the grass, and the temperature changes. When the temperature drops, they move towards warmer places. They always live more or less in the spring. And now I want to take you more forward. I did
Sorry,
some,
which tribes were they?
first of all, I've written a book that I'm
Okay.
looking forward for the right time to launch it. But there were two types of tribes that allowed me, that their names, one of them was Mamasani and the other one was Safikani. But there are many tribes that live in the mountains of Shiraz. And Shiraz is exactly
Okay.
the same place where we know the wine of Shiraz came from, right? Where now the roots of it are being taken to different places in the world and they make Shiraz wines.
Mm.
However, and that was also where Persepolis was being placed. Very old, ancient civilizations decided to live in those mountains. It was because of the weather, the fertility of the land, and the location so beautiful. Even there's a place called Lost Paradise, and it's where the ground opens, and then in the middle of, I can't say desert, because when we think about deserts in West, it's kind of like sand everywhere. That's Kavir or Sahara. But desert is where there are trees, when there's rocks and there's soil, there's kind of this kind of varieties of land. But in the middle of that, the land has opened up
Mm.
and there's a huge waterfall in the middle
Mm.
of there, and there's this greenery. And that's where they call it the Lost Paradise. This is where these tribes hang out. They weave rugs, as I can show some of them like on my
Mm.
floor, and then the simplicity and the forms and symbols. They have usually animals because they can move some of the animals with them, use their wool. Many of them are very wealthy people. But that's the way that they live. They have even houses in cities that they rent out. But that's how they live and they move with the season. So I can talk a lot about that.
So this is the preview. Everyone follow Abdollah and wait for the launch of the book. And if there are any publishers watching the
Yeah.
pod, someone's interested in a mainstream publisher of
Mm.
amazing, miraculous stories.
They're really, really good stories. From the time that I saw the earthquake in Iran, it's all to do with the book really delves into how the events shape our decisions. What defines the quality of a decision at these junctions? And that's something been always fascinating to me. The first book is going to be my time in Iran all the way to that time I come to the UK, and that's finished and written. The second one is the time that I start from the UK. So I'm in the place that I want to make a living. I've done my research and I'm coming out of those mountains and the deserts. At the same time, I was studying Persian carpets and rugs at University of Arts. There was a University of Arts in the middle of the desert that they had done. It was an experimental project. It was so cool. And then I decided to become a furniture maker and to be able to translate those languages into furniture. So there I became fascinated by Japanese joinery, where they kind of, just like how nomadic tribe, they weave all of these threads to one another and turn them into rugs and carpets and kilims. The Japanese joinery is about creating joints that are clicking to one another, and somehow we don't have to glue things up for them to stay together. I really wanted to stay away from glue and just gluing things up. I never really enjoyed doing something that is not reversible. So I wanted to make kind of reversible furniture, things that I could make, and then someone with a hammer could just take them apart and see how they are made. So that was my fascination with form, to be able to see it and understand the process. But later I could explain it. At the time, I couldn't explain what is it that I'm trying to do here. It was just everything that I knew that I want to avoid. So now I can explain it. Moving forward, I came to UK. I wanted to master my craft, and I had just made a small success in Iran, and people knew me as this guy who make crazy furniture. But I knew that there are so many masters out there. So I got myself here, and through a long journey. First, I was a student, and then I made my business here.
But you went to art school, right?
When I came to UK, I came to a language school just to start learning English. And then I didn't go directly to university first. I went to college years after I came to UK. But first, I wanted to make sense and go and learn from masters. So I learned from many people, some of them more on a conceptual level in meeting, and they gave me mentorship, some of them directly in their workshops, from Derek Jones to John Makepeace to Mark Fish, some of them directly in their workshops, some of them, but I had to make a living, I had to make money purely. And I had the dream of becoming one of the best furniture makers in the world. So I always set the bar quite high for myself. And that helped me, So, okay, what does it mean to be one of the best? So I pushed myself really, really. And my work went to TV with BBC Two. They made a 4-episode program with few other craftspeople and designers and artists, and we all got together in a program. We did really interesting things called Victorian House of Arts and Crafts. Lots of magazines. So much happened around the work, and I think it was all because I really delved into the spontaneity and celebrated the organic forms. It was 2019 that I had some time after COVID to think and reflect, and I remembered my dream when I was a child. And in that university, that I was digging something and it made me so happy. And I remembered those sculptures in those studios. So I said to my wife that I want to go towards a sculpture and I want to stop my business. So everyone thought it was a crazy idea.
Certainly the way that your work sort of impressed me and how I first encountered it as a really interesting approach to public sculpture, right? For those of you who have been following the podcast, you know how much we hate public sculpture. Have we had a conversation about public sculpture, Jonathan?
Not
No?
overtly,
That's
yeah.
worth it. I'm certainly a huge fan of how terrible public sculpture is in general. And there are so many different ways of hating it, because it seems that 999 times out of 1,000, it will be awful, right? And then so when I saw your work, I thought, oh, this is that one time when something has succeeded. And I'm just wondering, so at which stage you decided how you developed your artistic practice and sculptural practice, and whether it was always intended as something to be seen beyond the confines of a gallery walls. How did you arrive at a space which engages with the public on a monumental scale, and whether that was always the intention? Because given everything that we've heard so far, it feels like almost like a natural progression to be at large with nature and in a broader space. How do you see it?
Thanks for the question and thanks for the comment. Means a lot, really. Those who are graduated from Royal College of Arts know one thing is that the college is very where I got my master's from in sculpture. It's very much driven around critics. And I really myself enjoyed that. Some people didn't enjoy it. I really thrived on critic and debate and conversation. So very soon at the college, I realized that how important it is for a work to create dialogue. Or some people it doesn't matter for them. For me, it was important. For some artists, as long as they have said the message that they want to say. But for me, it was something a bit more challenging, I think, which driving that thinking and being able to hear other people's opinion about my work. And that was something, not on that realm that I am what I think I am side, is more on is the work speaking to people at its time? And that was important to me. Something very strange happened where I was parking my car around Royal College, which was 2 years, when the guy who was in charge of the car park in South Kensington realized that I'm going to Royal College, I'm doing sculpture, we became kind of friends. I really enjoyed hanging out with him, sometimes had a tea with him in his little cabin. And he said to me one thing, I just don't take my children to parks to see sculpture because they just don't make sense to me at all. And it doesn't make any sense to them as well. Make something that we understand what it is. And I was feeling like, oh God, what a weird comment. But that stayed in my head. I took it seriously somewhere in my mind because it's always easy to talk about Marcel Duchamp, isn't it? Where something that from everyday object of life came in the middle of the space for us to talk about. Or how minimalists put a cube in the middle of a space for us to talk about the space and our own presence in the space. But how we understand form is something that goes all the way back. From Plato, they thought that the forms are all shadows that we see in the world. And then Aristotle came and said, like, but hold on a second, there is material as well that defines also the form, and they have this dialogue with each other. And then Kant comes to play, starts talking about space, time, and also culture, and how mind starts shaping forms. So I think I'm interested in how we all talk about something called abstract. So abstract for me is something like, for example, the word freedom. I think about it quite a lot. The word freedom for every land, every culture means something different. But the word freedom, when you say freedom, makes sense to everyone. But until they talk about it.
Yeah.
Until they do. And that's how war gets started, right?
Yeah, exactly. So for me, this question of when anything suggests literature is very abstract in all cultures. And when I think art, and the public sculpture specifically, I think, public art, comes to play is where language has failed and art can enter and start a dialogue or be a conversation starter where everyone start having a dialogue through that form. We all have had a conversation with other people that we start talking about something and we forget what we've been talking about, and it just goes to so many different levels, and one person, hold on a second, this is what we were talking about. And I think when we have a sculpture in the public sphere where we're all looking at the form, we keep coming back to that. And I think it was incredibly moving for me when I one day stepped into the park, Regent's Park, and I saw 10 or 12 people around my work. And these people were not part of the frieze. They were people who chose to take time out of their day to look at what is this. And I looked, and I have a video of it. There were children, older people, middle age. They were all standing. And some people were talking to each other about the work. And there I realized that I have a mission much bigger than myself.
So basically, you made some art. You actually made some art,
I
right?
actually made some art. And on the part of that question that you asked about whether it was this always something intentional, I always followed the practice. I always tried to follow the research and the practice and be also responsive to what's been done before me. You know, the books behind me are all not just random. People have come and suggested me, oh, do you know this person? Do you know this artist? Do you know that? And I went and bought the book and I studied that. So it's all the dialogue that started from the form that I made, and I got to know about myself, but I also really respect what happened before me.
So I want to pick up on something you spoke beautifully about earlier, and I suppose we'll have to read about it in the book, but this time you spent with these nomadic people and in a kind of mystical connection with nature, and then just scanning your work through your Instagram and on the internet, and looking at the way that you work with wood and how wood is even in the way you burn the wood, and there's a kind of ritual element of that as well. Certainly the way you present that and the way you tell the story says something to me that wood is not just a kind of arbitrary material. It's something that you have a kind of mystical conversation with. And so in that sense, trees and wood, tell me about that dimension of your work.
It's a great question. One day at one of the crits at the RCA, an artist, Elizabeth Dimitriov, I never forget, she said to me, why wood? And I got stuck there, and it was a moment of identity crisis suddenly. So there are few dimensions which a short can tell you. One of them is purely was a material that I worked with. My hand knows wood. My mind thinks wood. And it's the material that I more or less identify myself with. But on another dimension, I think about, where we talked about how literature and ideas can be very limiting. I'm always thinking about how each piece that I make could have something that people all recognize, and they can enter through that, and then they can go multiple different layers if they wanted to. One example of that, the work in Regent's Park, it has horns. Immediately suggests sounds. There is a circle, people know what circle is on one side, and people know what a vase is. And then now we can start having a dialogue. At a different scale, I think about trees as a society that living amongst all of us, mankind.
So you're suggesting that
And
trees are almost like a parallel civilization that we live amongst.
exactly. When we talk about trees, there's no philosophy or ideology or any specific way of living, or to some extent, that somehow everyone loves trees. And this relationship that our bodies have with trees, for me, is fascinating. How accessible it is that we forget. And I'm very interested in that. I'm very interested in this material that I can go and find the salvaged wood from fallen trees to industrial wastes that I go and find. And I've built lots of different relationships, and they all have different stories. But where I'm heading, and a lot trying to bring into my work slowly, is the fact that there is something between our bodies and trees. And that's our breath. It's our livelihood. We breathe what they exhale. It's almost like a constant romance that we forget. There's so much. It's such a great field for research. It's such a great field for connecting. And in a way, for me, it's a hack. It's a hack to be able to use those narratives and researchers to work with, and also be able to communicate. I've extracted the sound out of trees, and certainly I'm not the first person who's done that, of course, but I bring them into my studio, and I'm making works with the vibrations that are coming out of the trees, because these are alive. This very, very basic feeling that I am alive and that tree is alive. And that's just such an amazing thing.
I mean, also, new studies are always coming out of the trees are sentient, and they communicate through their roots structures, and they're sentient to our present
Mycelium
and things. I mean, we're surrounded by parallel civilizations, sentient parallel civilizations. We're just supremely arrogant as a species, right? We just think we're above it all, and that's fascinating. You mentioned, sounds and music, because when I think, it's definitely with neighbors, sound is very implicit through the shape of the horn, but also there is kind of an elegant poetry that is quite, reminds me of musical structures in the way you construct your works. There seems to be a rhythm and timing to the way you approach them. And I'm just wondering, what role music, does it have a more expansive role in your practice?
It's always been part of my life, music. I learned from nomadic tribes that music is one way of connecting, is the easiest way of connecting to our surroundings. It's very advanced technology, specifically when it shows itself in a spontaneous and improvised form. Our idea of sound is always something healing in a way. And there's a huge level of I don't knowing why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I'm always learning about it. And so there is some level that I understand that why I need to do that because I just see the traces of it in my life that I never went. And then there's so much curiosity that keeps me going because I want to know why. One of my friends recently, Nicola Peel, she's an environmental activist. However, she talked about that she's got some inflammation that's happening in this rare problem that she has in her body. That she said that apparently she's tried everything, doesn't work. She still has the pain in her body. And she called me and said, look, do you remember your installation that you projected the sounds of the trees live in your studio? I said, yes. Can you do that on my body? Because it could be the only hope that I have. Because the way that I felt in your studio is how I need to feel again.
Wow.
So right now I'm in the middle of building a sculpture for her to sit in the middle and to be able to experience that throughout her body. So I am not a scientist and I'm not planning to become a scientist because it's just a whole different expertise and I wish I could. But us as artists, we experiment and we have fun, we play and we sense with our emotions and we sense through our bodies what feels right. And maybe science comes around afterwards and said, oh, look, this is something that they experimented. Maybe there's something here going on. But we just sense it's right. And that's what we do. We just increase the sensitivity so much that we sense few things. And I'm not talking about necessarily from heavens or I'm not connected to that realm, but I can feel the vibrations in my body. I can
Well, how do you know
feel.
you're not connected to that realm? You know what I'm saying? It's like you've just articulated your connection and then you just went into a defeatist. I did a master's at Royal College and they will ostracize me as somebody who brings in God because it brings me to my next question is like, how do you, considering how holistic your approach to art is, you know, of the idea of being part of the one. How do you feel? And you mentioned previously that your peers in art school, in your masters, were people who wanted to just express their ideas. And I feel it's something that Jonathan and I often talk about, that there is a didactic approach to art practice that has taken hold. And I call it the atheist approach because it's a denialist approach. And it's very egotistical, saying my opinion is so important to the exclusion of the conversation that art engenders. And it seems to be kind of a dominant narrative that artists project an arrogance to know what is the right thing. And so you've just articulated that you don't know. The unknowing is the good thing, is the space that we can all share in and share and discover things. How do you negotiate being kind of an outlier to that mainstream? Provided you feel that you're an outlier, you may not feel you're an outlier, because I think that subterraneously everyone agrees that we don't know.
Valerie, I agree with you. I don't know. The more I study, the more I have a background. I was grown up around Sufis, and my father is a scientist, but he also teaches Rumi. And that's something I grew up around. And for a long time, I thought that is the way of looking at the world. And then I started understanding design and form, and there was a whole new angle of looking at the world. And for the last few years, I've been also reading philosophy as well, like trying to about 4 to 7 hours a week. I'm trying to be engaged to philosophy, and that's a whole different way of being able to articulate the world. And I think for me, what I did, I said, okay, this is my lifetime, and it doesn't seem that I'm going to know it all within this lifetime at all. It's so short for my silly brain to be able to make sense of it all. So I decided to study on people before me through arts, through philosophy. And it's fascinating to see all of these debates have already been done. Idea to think that I know today. For me, myself, as an artist, I like to position myself in the place that I question and I invite others to question. And I only can ask another question or refine my question in order to more people can enter this question. And the work neighbors at the park did that. It was inviting people to come and question together. It wasn't suggesting anything. In a way, it was saying, hey, look, there are two equals. On one side, there's light, there's one side, there's heaviness, and then they're all on the same ground. And now let's talk. Um, I like to keep myself. It helps me to realize that I don't know. And
Yeah.
the moment I think I know, I'm very worried that I stop and think that, hey, look, this is it. I don't know. Spinoza says, when you said about one, Spinoza becomes very interesting. He really brought this idea that we are part of the nature. You explained it so well, that we are one as the whole nature. We're not necessarily separate from that. But I really think that I would really recommend for people who listening to this podcast, to get engaged to philosophy and give themselves a few years. Start to see what did Plato said, how did was our understanding about form, and then how is our understanding about love? What does a dialogue mean? And one recently said to me that, but why do we need to read philosophy when we already know all of the answers, all everything is inside us? And that was a very good question, because, of course, all of these philosophers come and try to articulate what is this, what is that. But I think it's all such a cloud that it helps us to be able to talk and speak to one another and address best with least amount of understanding so we can enter into a new space together.
I mean, it seems to me that your perspective is very much conditioned on the ability of seeing things from multiple perspectives because of your travel and because of your intercultural experience. But in a way, I see that your position is almost at right angles to a lot of kind of binary political mainstream thought, both left wing and right wing, which is kind of governed by a savior sort of philosophies, like, in a crusading kind of positions, like we know the truth and everyone who doesn't agree with us is immediately damned and doomed. Your previous comments reminded me of Voltaire saying, seek the truth, but beware of those who find it. And I think that we live in a world where so many people have found the same kind of truth, and that they want to kill everyone else who doesn't agree with them. And I think the West is very much, reinfected with it, in a sense. I encourage everyone to study history rather than philosophy as a primary, because history will teach you that nothing is new under the sun, and then we've experienced all of these things before. And then so to see the Western world and descend to a state of stupid and also crusading is really kind of disappointing. So it makes people who don't subscribe to binary positions feel like they're kind of on an island that is open to different plurality of views. That's my kind of non-optimistic position on a day when it rains a lot in Harare, which it just started pouring, which is not good. But yeah, what is your take? What's your hot take?
I think it's a very open-ended question, but I think what comes to my mind is that what is a solution to the time that we are in? The other one is that what angle should we look at the world maybe? We're all in the same room and there is an elephant in the room. And we all have different types of torches. One person's got a candle, one person's got to look at my projector. But there's no one way to be able to shed light onto an object and see all around it, unless we can all talk to one another and say, okay, what do you see on the other side of the room? Because if I shed a light on the leg of the tree, I would say probably of a leg of an elephant, I would say, well, probably it's a tree. And, the other person might look at another part and say, oh, that's a knife. This life is a knife. I think the hack, you're right. It's the most important time to really urgently, yes, read history, to be able to see what's happening in the world right now, to be able to have a critical understanding of politics and the joke of it, see the joke and say, they definitely don't know this part of the history. Why are they repeating it? But then there's also then philosophy, to be able to communicate and articulate and be able to listen and see things for what they are, rather than see things through our subjective self, which can become very difficult to filter things through and have always a open-ended outcome. I was reading a book about Heidegger because it's very difficult to read Heidegger, and that was an aha moment. It was very well explained. It's the same thing that East also talks about, but in West, it's been articulated better, I think, in a way that like that musical notes, you know, they can pick it up and understand it and replay it. In East, most of the things are being spoken through heart. Everything goes through the heart. And it talks about how we need to become self-conscious. But in order to become self-conscious, first we need to spend a lot of time educating to become conscious. And then there's so much to be able to learn and work on ourselves to become self-conscious, to be able to see ourselves. And I think some people, we are all in the world in different stages that we think that we have arrived. And then, okay, I've arrived now, I want to make decisions for everyone. Whereas I think our understanding of educating ourselves to become self-conscious, if there's a freeing moment within that, which I think when it's not just a Heidegger, I'm using that to explain maybe what Rumi said, and maybe in Buddhism they talk about, or, they're all trying to say the same thing. To be able to ground ourselves, the technology of being humble, which I call it, to remind ourselves that, man, I'm gonna go back to the soil. This form is literally clay. So don't take it too seriously.
I've just finished reading this sort of epic tome by Gurdjieff, Tales of Beelzebub to his grandson. He goes on a long journey, but right at the end, his grandson asks him, he paints a very bleak picture for humankind's hope of attaining some peace. And the grandson asks him, is there any hope? And if there is, what is that hope? Beelzebub says, the only hope really is that man understands that he will die and that everything and everyone around him will also die. And to have this primal sense of presence of that mortality gives hope for immortality. That's essentially what he's saying.
Yeah. And exactly. Thank you so much for sharing it. And also, I like to add that makes you celebrate where you are.
That's it.
You
Yeah.
know, makes you just celebrating where we are in the time that we are in. And, nobody knows if you did or didn't do one decision, how else things would have changed. We all have come to times that we think, oh, if I hadn't met that person or if I hadn't gone to that cafe, my life would be different. One of the best thing that ever happened to me was that when my workshop got broken into and they took all of my tools. And I thought that's the worst day of life. But it was a whole new beginning for me because it pushed me through a whole new perspective of seeing things. And I pushed myself to compensate. And that pushing really helped me in so many and taught me so many new lessons. I really think that seeing good in darkness, I think it's lucky also to be able to see the darkness. I think it would be very sad that everything is just happy all the time.
Mm.
And I think celebrating that too,
Mm.
and to be able to see, okay, that's the dark side of the moon, but it's the bright side of the moon.
Yeah.
But they're all so cool at the same time. So I feel that the abstract answer is this: we're all dancing in different ways. Some people just want to turn around, some people just want to do lots of different moves, but accepting that we're all dancing in different ways.
And is that the job of the artist to remind us?
I don't know.
I think this would be a good way to end the interview. I love the fact that we can end on I don't know, because that is the crux of things, is that we're okay with not knowing. Yeah, thanks so much, Abdollah.
Thank you.